Imagine being told by your homeowners association that your yard was an embarrassment, too wild, too tall, too messy. The letters kept coming, the warnings grew sharper, and finally, the threats of fines arrived, all because the tall grass in your yard, swaying gently in the breeze, refused to meet their strict vision of uniform lawns. But here's the twist. What the HOA didn't know is that those same blades of grass weren't just weeds. They were part of a protected natural habitat, a rare ecosystem legally safeguarded by state and federal law. So when the HOA pushed harder, demanding the grass be cut, they unknowingly stepped into a battle they could never win. This is the story of how one homeowner turned a war over unsightly grass into a stunning victory by proving that sometimes nature itself carries more authority than an entire association. Chapter 1. The First Letters. It started like most HOA conflicts do, quietly, almost insignificantly. A single envelope, slipped into the mailbox, stamped with the HOA's insignia, carrying words that seemed harmless at first glance. Your yard does not comply with community standards. Please trim your lawn to the required height within 14 days. It was written in the same polite but firm tone that so many neighbors had already grown to resent. A tone that masked its hostility beneath the illusion of order. The homeowner, let's call him David, looked out at his yard that morning with a mix of disbelief and irritation. To anyone else, it was just grass. But to him, it was more than that. The tall stalks had been there for years, waving with the seasons, home to butterflies, bees, and even rare songbirds that had long vanished from surrounding neighborhoods. Neighbors often commented on how his yard looked different, a little wilder, yes, but alive. It wasn't just grass, it was habitat. But the HOA didn't see it that way. They saw non-compliance. They saw disorder in a neighborhood that prized conformity. And so, the first letter wasn't the last. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This time, the words carried weight. Failure to comply will result in fines of $50 per day, beginning immediately after the deadline. The tone had sharpened. The clock was ticking, and David knew this was no longer something he could ignore. For most homeowners, this might have been the end of the story. A quick mowing, a reluctant surrender, just to avoid the headache of confrontation. But David was different. He had a quiet confidence in the land he lived on, and he knew something the HOA clearly didn't. This wasn't just tall grass. It was protected. Years earlier, he had researched his property's unique placement along a corridor of wetlands. It turned out that his yard contained native prairie grass, a habitat recognized by state environmental agencies as critical for pollinators and migratory birds. Cutting it wasn't just optional, it was illegal. The HOA thought they were dealing with just another stubborn homeowner. But in reality, they were picking a fight with nature itself and the laws that protected it. Still, the association pressed forward. Notices turned into threats. Committee members began whispering about escalating matters to liens or even legal action. They believed their authority was absolute, that their rules outweighed everything else. But David knew better. And as he tucked those warning letters into a growing stack on his kitchen counter, he began preparing. Not just to defend himself, but to reveal a truth that would shake the entire HOA to its core. The grass wasn't the problem. The HOA's ignorance was. And very soon they were about to find out just how big of a mistake they had made. The HOA was relentless. To them, tall grass meant one thing: violation. No excuses, no exceptions. By the third letter, their tone had lost all politeness. The words read like a list of threats: daily fines, liens on property, possible legal action. They even hinted that David's refusal to comply could negatively impact neighborhood property values. It was the same script they used on everyone: pressure, intimidation, conformity. But this time, they had chosen the wrong battleground. Because David had already done his research. His property wasn't just a random yard with weeds gone wild. It was part of a documented ecological corridor. Years earlier, when the subdivision was built, environmental surveys had identified patches of native prairie grass that stretched along certain properties, including his. In fact, the very same HOA that was now threatening him had signed agreements to respect those habitats when the community was first developed. But over time, as new board members came and went, that history had been forgotten or ignored. David kept every letter, every notice, stacking them neatly in a folder. With each one, he grew more certain that this wasn't just about his yard. It was about principle. And then came the first in-person confrontation. On a bright Saturday morning, 2 HOA board members walked up his driveway, clipboards in hand. They didn't knock. They didn't greet him with neighborly courtesy. Instead, they stood on the edge of the grass, gesturing toward the tall stalks like inspectors at a crime scene. To them, this wasn't beauty. It wasn't habitat. It was disorder that threatened the very image of their carefully controlled community. David stepped out, calm but firm, and simply told them, "This land is protected, by law." The board members smirked, dismissing his words as defiance. They left with threats of escalating to enforcement action. But what they didn't know was that David wasn't bluffing. He had already contacted the state's Department of Natural Resources. He had spoken to an environmental officer who confirmed what he suspected. The prairie grass on his land was legally protected. Cutting it down could result in fines, not for him, but for anyone who forced the destruction. For the first time, the balance of power shifted. The HOA believed their rules were supreme, that their bylaws could bend reality itself. But laws of the land, actual laws written into state statutes, stood above them. Still, ignorance and arrogance often walk hand in hand. Instead of backing down, the HOA doubled down. They scheduled a formal violation hearing. They threatened to hire contractors to cut the grass themselves and bill David for the cost. They spoke in absolutes, as if no rule of nature or state could possibly override their authority. But David wasn't intimidated. Because now, it wasn't just about his yard. It was about exposing how far an HOA would go when they put appearances above truth, rules above reason, and control above everything else. And the deeper he dug into their tactics, the more he realized this was about to become a battle not just for his home, but for the land itself. The HOA thought they had him cornered. But what they didn't realize is that every move they made was bringing them closer to a fight they could never win. The HOA believed they were untouchable. But David had something they didn't expect: allies with real authority. Just days before the violation hearing, he forwarded every threatening letter to the Department of Natural Resources. Along with it, he included photos of the grass, historical surveys of the land, and even the original development agreements that specifically mentioned preservation of native prairie habitats. It wasn't long before the state responded. An environmental officer called him back, confirming what David already knew. The grasses on his property weren't just overgrown weeds. They were a federally recognized pollinator habitat, home to monarch butterflies, migratory birds, and endangered native plants. Destroying it wouldn't just be a violation of local guidelines, it would be breaking state and federal law, and the penalties? Far harsher than any HOA fine. The irony was sharp. For weeks, the HOA had been treating David like the reckless one, the rule breaker. But in truth, they were the ones standing on the edge of committing a crime. David let them walk straight into it. The violation hearing went ahead as planned. A handful of board members sat at a long table, papers stacked high, trying their best to look like judges in a courtroom. They spoke of community standards, uniformity, and resale value. They listed his fines, tallying up a number so outrageous it was meant to scare him into compliance. Then they announced their final threat. If he didn't trim the grass himself, they would hire a landscaping crew to cut it down and charge him for it. David sat quietly, listening, letting them hang themselves with every word. And then he pulled out a letter. It was an official notice from the Department of Natural Resources, stamped and signed. It explained, in no uncertain terms, that his property contained a protected ecosystem. Any attempt to remove or alter it without government approval would result in penalties ranging from tens of thousands of dollars in fines to possible criminal liability. The room went silent. For the first time, the HOA members' confidence cracked. They shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves, flipping through their papers as if they could somehow rewrite reality. But the facts were unshakable. Their bylaws didn't trump state and federal law. Their threats, their letters, their entire case had just collapsed. Still, rather than admit defeat, they tried to spin it. One board member suggested David should have informed them earlier. Another claimed they were simply misunderstood and only acting in the neighborhood's best interest. But the truth was clear. They hadn't done their homework. They assumed power gave them the right to control everything. And in their arrogance, they had walked directly into a trap of their own making. David didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He simply left the hearing with his papers in hand, knowing the battle had shifted in his favor. Because now, it wasn't just about winning against the HOA. It was about holding them accountable. And as news began to spread, neighbors whispering, local conservationists taking interest, the HOA's image of authority was crumbling faster than they could patch it back together. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, David wasn't the one on defense. He was the one holding the line, and the HOA was cornered. Humiliation is a bitter pill, and the HOA wasn't about to swallow it quietly. Within a week of the hearing, David began noticing strange activity near his property. One morning, he saw landscapers parked just outside his lot, engines idling, their trucks filled with mowers and trimmers. The HOA had clearly ignored the state's notice, or perhaps they thought he was bluffing. But David was ready. He called the Department of Natural Resources before a single blade was touched. By the time the workers were about to roll their equipment onto his yard, an officer arrived in a marked state vehicle. The workers were stopped dead in their tracks. What happened next wasn't just a warning, it was a public embarrassment. The officer pulled the landscapers aside, explained the laws, and reminded them that they could be fined personally if they destroyed the habitat. The crew quickly packed up and left, shaking their heads, not wanting any part of the HOA's mess. But the HOA wasn't done. They shifted tactics, moving from physical threats to propaganda. Flyers appeared in mailboxes accusing David of lowering property values and endangering children with tall weeds. At board meetings, members spoke darkly about how one homeowner's negligence could ruin the whole neighborhood. The irony, of course, was that David's yard wasn't neglected, it was thriving. Butterflies danced over the grasses, songbirds nested along the edges. On warm evenings, fireflies lit up the prairie like lanterns. Neighbors who once frowned at the site now stopped to admire it, even snapping photos. But the HOA doubled down, making themselves look more desperate with every move. Their final attempt came when they contacted the county zoning office, trying to have David cited under local property maintenance ordinances. For a moment, it seemed like this could be their trump card. A county inspector did arrive, but what they found wasn't what the HOA had hoped. The inspector walked David's land slowly, taking notes, snapping photos, measuring grass height. And then, instead of issuing a violation, they filed a formal recognition. The property was classified as a protected natural area. That single designation changed everything. It wasn't just David's word against the HOA anymore. It was written into the county's records. The HOA had tried to destroy him through every channel they could think of, but each attempt only backfired, strengthening his case, exposing their ignorance, and painting them as bullies overreaching their authority. And with every failed tactic, David's confidence grew, because the truth was no longer hidden in documents and letters. It was out in the open, His land wasn't just his backyard. It had become a sanctuary, and now the government itself recognized it as such. The HOA thought they were building a case, but what they had really built was David's shield. Now the question wasn't if they would lose, it was how publicly they would be forced to back down. When the county formally recognized David's land as a protected natural area, the ripple effects were immediate and devastating for the HOA. Their evidence of overgrown weeds, their constant letters, their threats, all of it collapsed under the weight of official recognition. The very habitat they demanded be destroyed was now legally untouchable, and David wasn't about to let them slip away quietly. With the help of the conservation attorney, he filed a civil claim for harassment and attempted destruction of protected habitat. The documentation was ironclad: months of violation notices, photos of posted flyers, records of landscapers nearly trespassing, and the zoning complaint that had blown up in the HOA's face. When the case reached the county court, the judge barely needed convincing. The HOA had not only overstepped their authority, they had exposed themselves to legal liability. The ruling was swift. The HOA was ordered to cease all enforcement actions against David's property, issue a public retraction to the neighborhood, cover a portion of David's legal expenses. But the real punishment wasn't written in legal jargon. It was the humiliation of having their campaign against him dragged into the open, where every homeowner in the community could see just how far they had gone and how badly they had lost. In the weeks that followed, the once feared board members kept their heads down. Meetings grew quiet, their voices muted, their authority weakened. Homeowners who once blindly supported the board now questioned every decision, every rule, every fine. The illusion of control had cracked, and David, he didn't just win, he transformed. His yard became a symbol, a kind of neighborhood landmark. Families would walk by to point out the prairie flowers to their kids. Birdwatchers asked permission to observe rare species nesting there. The local paper even ran a story on the man who fought the HOA and saved a habitat. The HOA's obsession had backfired so completely that David emerged not as a troublemaker, but as the community's unlikely hero. The tall grass swayed in the wind, alive with insects, birds, and light. And every time David looked at it, he smiled. Because what the HOA saw as an eyesore had become a living reminder of his victory. They had tried to bury him under rules and threats, but instead, they planted the seeds of their own defeat. And now, standing in the evening glow as fireflies danced above the prairie, David knew one truth. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting nature grow.